Black man gives runaway bride a ride, unaware that her ex is a dangerous millionaire. If you lay a finger on her, I guarantee you'll regret it for the rest of your miserable life. David Carter stood on the porch of his house, staring at three men in suits who had just gotten out of a black BMW. The tallest of them smiled contemptuously, clearly not taking the threat from a 42-year-old mechanic seriously. 12 hours earlier, David would never have imagined that the simple gesture of giving a desperate woman a ride in the rain would turn his life into a nightmare. But when he saw that lonely figure walking barefoot along the highway at 2 in the morning, still wearing an elaborate soaked wedding dress, his protective instinct spoke louder than prudence. "Please help me," she had whispered when he stopped his car, her eyes red from crying. "I have nowhere to go." David knew that look. It was the same desperation he had seen in the mirror after he lost his job at the town's main repair shop, when he discovered that the staff reduction had actually been an excuse to hire only white employees. The difference was that he had fought and managed to open his own shop on the outskirts of town. This woman seemed to have given up the fight. "I'm Isabella," she murmured as she warmed herself in the passenger seat. "I ran away from my own wedding 3 hours ago." During the drive to her house, David discovered that she had abandoned a life of luxury to escape a controlling fiancé. What he didn't discover was that Richard Blackwood, heir to a real estate empire, wasn't just controlling, he was dangerous. And men like him didn't take losing their property lying down, especially to someone they considered inferior. Isabella slept on the living room couch, exhausted. David stayed up, making coffee and thinking about how bad this whole situation smelled. Rich women didn't run away from millionaire weddings to hide in suburban homes. Unless they were running from something much worse than a boring life. It was the next morning when the men in suits showed up. They didn't knock on the door, they just pushed it open and walked in as if they owned the place. The leader, a bald man with a scar on his face, got straight to the point. "Where's the boss's bride?" David felt something familiar grow inside his chest. It was the same silent anger he felt when rich customers looked at him suspiciously when they entered the workshop, as if he were going to steal their cars. The same indignation he felt when police officers stopped him for a routine check 3 times a month. "I don't know what bride you're talking about," he replied calmly, even though he knew Isabella was hiding in the back room. The man laughed, pulling out his cell phone. "Boss, we found her. She's with a mechanic." The way he said mechanic made it clear what he really thought. Over the next few minutes, David heard Richard Blackwood's voice on speakerphone, spewing threats that would have made any normal person back down. But David Carter was not a normal person. He was a man who had built his dignity brick by brick, client by client, after the system tried to break him. And something in the arrogant tone of this billionaire, in his absolute certainty that he could intimidate anyone he wanted, awakened a determination that surprised even David. Perhaps it was because he recognized in Isabella the same desperation he had once felt. Or perhaps it was simply because men like Richard needed to learn that not everything in this world was for sale. As the henchman left with promises to return, David watched Isabella emerge from her hiding place, trembling. She murmured an apology and said she'd better leave before she caused more trouble. "No," David replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "You stay. And if your boss wants to get anything back, he'll have to get past me first." What neither Isabella nor the henchman knew was that David Carter had learned some very valuable lessons about patience and planning during his years fighting prejudice. And men like Richard Blackwood, accustomed to getting everything with money and intimidation, always made the same fatal mistake: they completely underestimated those they considered inferior. If you're enjoying this story of courage and resilience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what David was about to discover about his millionaire visitor would completely change the rules of this game. 3 days after the visit from the thugs, David discovered what it meant to face a man with unlimited resources and zero scruples. Richard Blackwood hadn't lied about his intentions. He really would be back, but not in the way David expected. It all started on Monday morning when David arrived at the workshop and found 2 police cars parked in front. Detective Morrison, a bored-looking middle-aged white man, was holding a search warrant. "We've received an anonymous tip about stolen parts being sold at this establishment," Morrison announced, clearly not believing his own investigation. "We're going to need to search the premises." David watched silently as they searched every corner of the workshop he had built with his own hands. He knew exactly who was behind this charade, but he also knew that protesting would only confirm the prejudices Morrison already held. It was during the search that David received the first call. "Private number. Did you enjoy the show, David? Richard's voice was soft, almost gentle. That was just the warm-up. You have 24 hours to return my property. Isabella is not anyone's property. Richard laughed. Ah, but you're mistaken. When we invest $300,000 in someone's wedding, she automatically becomes an asset. And I protect my assets. The call was cut off. David put his cell phone away, watching the police finish their fruitless search. Morrison approached, visibly embarrassed. We didn't find anything suspicious. Sorry for the inconvenience. When the officers left, David sat down in the chair in his small office and allowed himself a moment of reflection. This wasn't the first time he'd faced the system trying to take him down. He had grown up in Detroit in the 1980s, when being a smart black kid meant being automatically suspected of anything that went wrong in the neighborhood. His father, Samuel Carter, had been a mechanic at Ford for 40 years until a corporate reorganization eliminated redundancies, code for laying off older, experienced black workers. David still remembered his father's words. Son, they're going to try to break you every way they can. Your strength isn't in fighting back the way they do, but in being smarter than them. On Tuesday, the pressure increased. 3 regular customers canceled scheduled services, all with the same evasive excuse about change of plans. David suspected that Richard had found a way to get to them. In the afternoon, Isabella showed up at the shop carrying 2 cups of coffee and a worried expression. David, maybe I should leave. I don't want you to lose your business because of me. He accepted the coffee, studying her face. Isabella had spent the last few days helping with the shop's accounting, organizing files and demonstrating an impressive aptitude for numbers that didn't fit with the luxury doll image Richard probably cultivated. Tell me about him, David said simply. Isabella sat down in the chair next to him, staring out the dirty workshop window. Richard controls everything through money. When we were dating, he paid my bills, my apartment, my car. I thought it was generosity. But it wasn't. It was an investment. Every gift came with expectations. Every favor had compound interest. She laughed bitterly. When I started questioning his decisions about our life, he simply cut off my credit card. He said he was helping me understand priorities. David nodded. He knew that kind of control well. But what really scared me was finding out how he treated people he considered inferior. Employees, waiters, anyone he couldn't buy. Isabella looked directly at David. He talked about you guys like you were problems to be managed, not people. On Wednesday, the escalation continued. David arrived at the workshop to find an unpleasant surprise. The building's owner, Mr. Williams, was there with 2 men in suits. David, I need to talk to you about the rent. Williams was an elderly man who had rented the space to David for 5 years without any problems. Now he avoided his gaze. I've received a very generous offer for this building. I'm going to have to ask you to vacate by the end of the month. One of the men in suits approached, extending a business card. Blackwood Properties. We'd be happy to help with the transition. David tucked the card away without looking at it. How much did he offer? Double the market value, Williams muttered. I can't turn it down. After they left, David sat down at his desk and analyzed the situation. Richard was playing a calculated game. First, destroy his reputation with false investigations. Second, sabotage his clients. Third, take away his workplace. It was a strategy he recognized, the same one he had seen corporations use against small black business owners his entire life. But Richard had made one fundamental mistake. He assumed David was just another obstacle to be removed with money and pressure. What the millionaire didn't know was that David Carter had spent his entire life studying men like him, understanding how they thought, how they operated. More importantly, David had learned to document everything. That night, while Isabella slept on the couch, David turned on his computer and began researching. Richard Blackwood, heir to a real estate empire, son of a family that had built its fortune on shady government contracts in the 1960s. Interesting. David opened a folder on his desk. Over the past 3 days, he had discreetly photographed every car that stopped in front of the shop, noted every strange phone call, recorded every threat. He had even kept the Blackwood Properties business card. He smiled for the first time in days. Richard thought he was hunting a scared mechanic from the suburbs. In fact, He was dealing with someone who had learned from childhood that survival depended on staying 3 steps ahead of predators. Thursday brought the final escalation. David was working under a car when he heard familiar voices. He crawled out and found the same henchmen from the first visit, but this time they weren't alone. Richard Blackwood had come in person. Tall, well-dressed, with that arrogant confidence that only generational money could buy, Richard surveyed the workshop as if inspecting something disgusting. "So you're the brave mechanic," he said, without extending his hand. "Isabella, darling, you've played around long enough. It's time to go home." Isabella left the office but stood beside David. "This is my home now. Don't be ridiculous. Look at this place." Richard gestured dismissively. "You were born for mansions, not for this. And you were born to own people." David spoke for the first time. Richard studied him with academic interest. "You really believe you can take me on? Man, I destroy entire companies before breakfast. You think a little workshop on the outskirts of town is some kind of challenge?" Each new humiliation only strengthened something inside David that his oppressors couldn't see, a quiet determination fueled by the very arrogance they tried to impose on him. What that privileged man didn't know was that every act of contempt was writing his own sentence, and David Carter had spent his entire life learning to be patient enough to collect compound interest on injustices like this. What Richard Blackwood didn't know was that David Carter had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of strategic patience. While the millionaire celebrated his small victories, the police investigation, the lost clients, the impending eviction, David was playing a completely different game. On Friday morning, David received an unexpected call that would change everything. "Mr. Carter? This is Marcus Washington from the Internal Revenue Service Investigation Division. Can we talk?" David almost laughed. After the local police, the landlord, and direct threats, Richard had escalated to federal agencies. But when Agent Washington showed up at the shop an hour later, David realized something was different. Washington was a black man in his 50s, with the weary posture of someone who had seen a lot of corruption during his career. He surveyed the shop with approval, noting the impeccable organization and the certificates of qualification on the walls. "Mr. Carter, we've received a tip about tax evasion related to this business," Washington said, but his tone was more polite than investigative. "I'll need to see your accounting books for the last 3 years." David handed everything over without hesitation. He had learned early on that complete transparency was the best defense against fabricated accusations. While Washington examined the documents, Isabella brought coffee for both of them. It was during this review that Washington made a seemingly casual observation. "Interesting. This is the 3rd investigation I've received this month involving small black business owners being anonymously reported for tax evasion." David stopped wiping his hands. "3rd. All the complaints came from the same law firm, Blackwood and Associates." Washington looked directly at David. "And all the companies investigated had some connection to disputes involving Richard Blackwood." The agent closed the folder. "His records are impeccable, Mr. Carter. There's no evidence of wrongdoing. But can I give you some advice? Men like Blackwood don't stop here." After Washington left, David sat down with Isabella in the small office. She had been unusually quiet throughout the visit. "There's something you haven't told me about Richard," David said, not as a question, but as a statement. Isabella sighed deeply. "When we were dating, he showed me things. Documents, contracts, recorded conversations. He said it was so I would understand how the world really worked." "What kind of things?" "Bribing public officials to get building permits. Threatening small property owners to force them to sell. Money laundering schemes through overpriced construction projects." Isabella looked out the window. "He thought I'd be impressed by his power." David felt something stir in his chest. "Do you have proof of this?" "I photographed everything with my cell phone. I thought I might need it someday." She pulled a smartphone from her pocket. "I never deleted anything." Over the next 2 hours, David examined dozens of photos Isabella had secretly taken. Fraudulent contracts, illegal payment spreadsheets, compromising messages between Richard and local politicians. "Isabella," David said calmly, "you weren't just running away from a marriage. You were running away from a criminal organization." Late that afternoon, David made a call he'd been planning for days. Tomas Rivera, Tribune Journal. Rivera was an investigative journalist David had known since community college. While David had chosen mechanics, Tomas had specialized in exposing corporate corruption. His reporting on gentrification and housing discrimination had won national awards. David Carter? I can't believe it. Long time no see, brother. Tomas, I need to talk to you. I have a story that will be of great interest to you. They met at a downtown cafe that evening. David brought a folder containing everything he had collected: photos of the thugs, recordings of the threats, documents about the forced purchase of the building, and most importantly, the evidence Isabella had kept. Tomas examined each item with growing professional excitement. My God, David. This is dynamite. Blackwood has been involved in municipal corruption for years, but we've never been able to get concrete proof. Now you do. More than that. With this evidence, I can connect dots we've been investigating separately for months. Tomas held up one of the photos showing Richard handing an envelope to a city councilman. This man approved 3 Blackwood projects that violated zoning codes. David leaned forward. How long do you need for a story? A week. Maybe 2 if we want to do it right. Tomas paused, studying David's face. But you need to know that publishing this will make Richard come after you with everything he's got. He has expensive lawyers and friends in high places. Then the story better be airtight. It will be. I promise. Over the weekend, David worked with renewed focus. Every car he repaired, every customer he served, was done with the meticulous precision of someone who knew he was being watched. Richard probably had spies reporting his every move. On Monday, the pressure increased again. David arrived at the shop and found a subpoena stuck to the door. A lawsuit for interference in a contractual relationship and alienation of affection, seeking $200,000 in damages. Isabella read the document with tears in her eyes. David, this is crazy. He's saying you seduced me to hurt his business. Of course he is. It's the classic move, turn the victim into the villain. But David wasn't worried. In fact, for the first time in days, he was smiling. Why are you smiling? Isabella asked, confused. Because he just made his first real mistake. David folded the subpoena carefully. By suing me, Richard has given me the legal right to request all of his company's financial documents during the discovery process. What does that mean? It means the predator just walked into his own trap. That night, David called Washington. The federal agent answered on the second ring. Mr. Carter? How can I help you? Agent Washington, remember when you said men like Blackwood don't stop here? Well, you were right. And now I have something that might interest the Department of Investigations. I'm listening. How about photographic evidence of bribery of public officials and documents proving money laundering in municipal contracts? The silence on the line lasted 5 full seconds. Mr. Carter, can you come to my office tomorrow morning? And bring everything you have. After the call, David sat on the porch with Isabella. The night sky was clear, and for the first time in weeks, they both felt hopeful. Do you really think this will work? Isabella asked. David looked at the workshop he had built, at the simple but honest life he had created. Isabella, Richard made the mistake that all predators make. He assumed I was easy prey. And aren't you? David smiled, remembering his father's words about being smarter than your oppressors. He'll find out that some prey know how to turn into hunters. The next morning, David woke up with a strange sense of calm. He had spent weeks being tormented by a man who considered other human beings as property to be acquired or discarded. Today, finally, he would begin the process of showing Richard Blackwood that some targets were more dangerous than they appeared. As he prepared to meet Agent Washington, David had no way of knowing that Richard had spent the entire night planning a final escalation that would test the limits of human decency. What the arrogant millionaire also didn't know was that each new attack only provided more ammunition for the storm that was about to descend on his world of privilege and impunity. Tuesday brought the final escalation David had predicted. Richard Blackwood showed up at the garage no longer with henchmen in suits, but with 2 clearly dangerous men. This time, the threats weren't about lawsuits or eviction. 48 hours, Richard said, the mask of civility finally slipping. If Isabella isn't in my office by Thursday, you two are going to find out that accidents happen a lot out in the suburbs. David continued working under the car, his voice calm. I understand the threat perfectly. Thank you for being so clear. David's calmness clearly irritated Richard. You don't understand who you're messing with, mechanic. I destroy people like you before breakfast. I'm sure you do. David climbed out from under the car, wiping his hands calmly. By the way, how did the meeting with the federal prosecutors go yesterday? Richard's face paled. What are you talking about? Agent Washington is very efficient, especially when he receives photographic evidence of bribery and money laundering. Richard laughed, but it sounded forced. What evidence? You're bluffing. David pulled out his cell phone and showed him one of the photos Isabella had taken, Richard handing an envelope to Councilman Morrison. Isabella documented everything for 2 years. Every bribe, every threat, every scheme. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Richard's cell phone ringing. He answered with visibly trembling hands. Mr. Blackwood? This is Tomas Rivera from the Tribune Journal. I'd like to comment on our article about municipal corruption that's coming out tomorrow. Richard hung up abruptly, but the phone rang again immediately. Richard Blackwood, FBI. You need to come with us for questioning about irregularities in municipal contracts. David watched the man who had terrorized her life for weeks begin to understand the extent of his downfall. The henchman had already discreetly backed away, clearly not wanting any association with a federal investigation. Impossible, Richard muttered, more to himself. I controlled all her contacts. I reviewed every document. You controlled what she let you see, Isabella said, appearing in the office doorway. I photographed everything you showed me, plus everything I thought you were hiding from me. Richard looked at her with a mixture of hatred and genuine panic. You have no idea what you've just done. I have contacts, expensive lawyers. Who won't be able to help you when the IRS freezes all your accounts this afternoon, David interrupted, glancing at his watch. Agent Washington was very specific about the procedures. Richard's phone rang for the 3rd time. This time, it was clearly his secretary, judging by the desperate tone of his voice. What do you mean, frozen accounts? Since when? His voice rose 2 octaves. And the city contracts have been cancelled? All of them. David approached as Richard finished the call, clearly in a state of panic. Do you know the difference between us, Richard? David said calmly. You always assumed I was just another obstacle to be removed. I spent weeks studying exactly how men like you operate. Studying what? Patience. Documentation. And most importantly, how predators always feel so secure that they make fatal mistakes. David smiled for the first time in weeks. Like physically threatening federal witnesses. Richard realized too late that the entire conversation had been recorded by the cell phone David had discreetly kept active in his pocket. Over the next 30 minutes, David and Isabella watched Richard Blackwood's empire crumble in real time. Calls from business partners canceling contracts, investigations being opened, bank accounts frozen. The man who had arrived so arrogant now sat on the workshop floor, his head in his hands, muttering about how this was impossible. Richard, David said, offering him a glass of water. Can I give you some advice? Next time you underestimate someone, remember that some people have spent their entire lives learning how to be smarter than their oppressors. When the federal agents arrived to take Richard away, he left in handcuffs, the man who had tried to destroy the lives of others being led away in disgrace. David hugged Isabella on the porch of the workshop, watching the last cars of the federal operation drive away. The nightmare was over, but something in David's satisfied smile suggested that the consequences for Richard had only just begun. The man who had assumed that a mechanic from the outskirts would be easy prey had just discovered that he had picked the wrong opponent. And as the sun set over the workshop he had almost lost, David realized that his life was about to change in ways he could not have imagined when he decided to give that desperate bride a ride. 6 months later, David Carter opened his second shop across town. Success had come unexpectedly. Tomas Rivera's article on municipal corruption had exposed not only Richard, but a whole network of businessmen who used intimidation against small businesses. Isabella stood beside him at the ribbon cutting, now co-owner and in charge of administration. They had married in a simple ceremony, with Washington and Rivera as witnesses. I never imagined that giving someone a ride in the middle of the night would change my life so much, David said, watching the line of customers waiting to be served. The irony was delicious. Richard was serving a 12-year sentence for corruption and witness intimidation. His assets had been confiscated, his political contacts had abandoned him, and he who had always despised ordinary people now depended on public legal aid. Dr. Morrison, the same detective who had conducted the fake investigation, showed up at the opening to apologize publicly. "David, you taught us that dignity is not measured by the size of your bank account." Agent Washington had become a personal friend of the family. "You know Richard tried to bribe me out of jail," he said during the celebratory barbecue. "He offered me $50,000 to review the evidence." David laughed, hugging Isabella. Some men never learn that there are some things money can't buy. The lesson was clear. Richard had lost everything by underestimating someone he considered inferior. David had gained everything by maintaining his dignity and acting with strategic intelligence. As they watched the activity in the new workshop, David reflected on his father's words. The best revenge is not to stoop to the level of those who hurt you, but to build something so solid that they can never destroy it. Richard had tried to break a man who already knew how to rebuild his life. David had waited patiently until the millionaire's arrogance became his own trap. The real victory was not only Richard's imprisonment, but the family David and Isabella had built, the respect they had earned in the community, and the example they had set for other small business owners facing intimidation. That night, as they closed the shop, Isabella asked, "Do you regret stopping that morning?" David smiled, remembering the desperate man who had found a woman lost in the rain. "Never. Sometimes what seems like a detour is exactly what we need to get where we're supposed to be." David and Isabella's story proved that courage, patience, and integrity always win over arrogance and intimidation. Richard learned the hard way that some people cannot be bought, broken, or intimidated, only respected. If this story of justice and overcoming adversity touched your heart, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that the best revenge is success built with dignity and honest work.